By 1918, the Great War was a race against time. For Germany, the clock was ticking, counting down to the moment America's immense power would arrive in force. Today, we explore the German High Command's final, desperate gamble. An all-or-nothing assault designed not just to win ground, but to shatter the Allied will. This is the story of revolutionary tactics, unprecedented advances, and ultimate exhaustion. This is the Spring Offensive, Operation Michael, the Kaiser's last battle. In the early spring of 1918, the Great War stood at a crossroads. For 3.5 years, the armies of Europe had bled each other white across the trenches of the Western Front. Millions had died. Empires had exhausted their treasuries. Entire generations had been consumed. And still, there was no end in sight. But now, in March 1918, Germany faced a stark, unforgiving reality. This was their last chance. They had to win the war now, or they would lose it forever. This is the story of Operation Michael, Germany's desperate, brilliant, ultimately futile attempt to win the First World War in a single, devastating blow. To understand the desperation behind Operation Michael, one must understand Germany's strategic position in early 1918. On the surface, Germany's situation appeared to be improving dramatically. In December 1917, Russia, exhausted by revolution, political chaos, and military defeat, had signed an armistice with the Central Powers. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk formally ended the war in the East, freeing approximately 50 German divisions from the Eastern Front to be transferred west. This was an enormous infusion of strength. For the first time since 1914, Germany would not have to fight a two-front war. They could concentrate their entire military power on the Western Front and attempt the decisive breakthrough that had eluded them for 3.5 years. But there was a clock ticking. And that clock was measured in American soldiers. The United States had entered the war in April 1917, and now, in early 1918, American troops were beginning to arrive in France in significant numbers. Not thousands, but hundreds of thousands. By the end of 1918, the American Expeditionary Force would number over 2 million men, fresh, well-equipped troops who had not been bled dry by years of attrition. The strategic calculation was brutally simple. Germany had a window of opportunity, perhaps 6 months, perhaps less, in which they would have numerical superiority on the Western Front. The divisions from Russia were arriving. The Americans had not yet deployed in decisive numbers. If Germany could launch a major offensive now, in the spring of 1918, they might break through the Allied lines, separate the British from the French, capture vital objectives, and force a negotiated peace before American strength became overwhelming. The architect of Germany's final gamble was General Ludendorff, the first quartermaster general and, alongside Field Marshal Hindenburg, the effective military dictator of Germany. Ludendorff had risen to prominence through his victories on the Eastern Front, the legendary triumph at Tannenberg in 1914, and subsequent successful campaigns against Russia. Now, in 1918, he turned his attention to the West and began planning the series of offensives that would come to be known as the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle, Germany's final, desperate attempt to win the war. Ludendorff was a brilliant tactician but a poor strategist. He understood how to win battles but struggled to translate battlefield success into strategic victory. This fundamental flaw would ultimately doom Operation Michael, but in the spring of 1918, as the plan came together, Ludendorff was confident. He had learned from the failures of previous offensives. He had studied the successful breakthrough at Caporetto in October 1917, where German forces had used revolutionary new tactics to shatter the Italian army. And he believed those same tactics could work against the British and French. The tactical innovation that would define Operation Michael was known by several names: infiltration tactics, Stormtrooper tactics, or Hutier tactics, named after General Oskar von Hutier, who had used them successfully on the Eastern Front. These tactics represented a complete break from the traditional approach to offensive warfare that had dominated the Western Front since 1914. The old method had been to attack along a broad front with massed infantry, attempting to overwhelm the defender through sheer weight of numbers. This had failed repeatedly, resulting in catastrophic casualties for minimal gains. The new doctrine was fundamentally different. Under the infiltration tactics, specially trained stormtrooper units, small, mobile teams of elite soldiers carrying light weapons, grenades, flamethrowers, and light machine guns, would advance not in waves but in small groups, seeking weak points in the enemy line. When they encountered strong resistance, they would not stop to fight. Instead, they would bypass the strong point and continue advancing, leaving it to be reduced by follow-on forces. The objective was not to capture ground methodically but to disrupt the enemy's command and control system. Stormtroopers would push deep into the rear areas, capturing or destroying headquarters, communication centers, artillery positions, and supply dumps. The enemy's defensive line would not be battered down through attrition, it would be paralyzed by cutting off the head from the body. Supporting this tactical approach would be a new form of artillery bombardment, the Feuerwalls or firewalls, a short, intense, carefully choreographed barrage that would suppress enemy artillery, destroy communication lines, and neutralize strongpoints, all while maintaining surprise. Rather than the week-long bombardments that had characterized previous offensives, the Feuerwalls would last only a few hours, giving the enemy no time to bring up reserves or reorganize defenses. But where to attack? The Western Front stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, over 400 miles of fortified positions. Ludendorff studied the Allied line, looking for weakness, and found it at the junction between the British and French armies, in the sector held by the British Fifth Army under General Hubert Gough. This sector had several vulnerabilities. First, it was the point where British and French command responsibilities met, a natural weak point where coordination might falter under pressure. Second, the British Fifth Army had recently taken over this sector from the French and had not yet fully developed its defensive positions. Third, the terrain, rolling chalk uplands scarred by the battles of the Somme in 1916 and 1917, offered few natural defensive obstacles. Ludendorff's plan was ambitious. Operation Michael would strike the British Fifth Army and the right flank of the British Third Army to the north. The objective was to split the British and French armies, driving a wedge between them. The British, threatened with being cut off from the channel ports through which they received all their supplies, would be forced to retreat northward toward the coast. The French, protecting Paris, would retreat southward. And into the gap between them would pour the German army, exploiting the breakthrough, capturing vital rail junctions like Amiens, and potentially forcing a negotiated peace. It was a plan that could win the war, or lose it forever. There would be no second chance. Germany was committing everything, its best troops, its remaining reserves, its last hope, to this single roll of the dice. On March 21, 1918, the dice would be thrown. In the pre-dawn darkness of March 21, 1918, along a front of approximately 50 miles stretching from Arras in the north to La Fère in the south, over 3 million men prepared for battle. On one side, British soldiers of the Third and Fifth Armies, many of them holding positions they had occupied for only weeks or days, many exhausted from recent fighting and undermanned due to casualties. On the other side, German assault divisions, specially trained, equipped with the best weapons Germany could provide, and knowing that this was their last chance to win the war. Between them hung a thick, impenetrable fog. The fog that morning was extraordinary, dense, cold, clinging to the ground, reducing visibility to just a few yards. British sentries in the forward trenches could see almost nothing. They stood in the murk, hearing distant sounds they could not identify, sensing but not seeing the enormous force gathering just hundreds of yards away. At 4:40 a.m., the fog was suddenly, violently illuminated by the flash of 10,000 German guns opening fire simultaneously. The Feuerwalls had begun. But this was unlike any bombardment the British had experienced before. Rather than the prolonged, days-long barrages that gave warning and allowed defenders to take shelter, this was short, intense, and devastatingly precise. The bombardment unfolded in 3 carefully timed phases. First, for 2 hours, German artillery targeted British command posts, communication centers, and artillery batteries deep in the rear areas. High explosive shells destroyed telephone exchanges and headquarters. Gas shells, phosgene and mustard gas, drenched rear areas, forcing British soldiers to wear suffocating gas masks and disrupting movement and communication. The second phase targeted the British artillery. German counter-battery fire, directed by careful pre-war reconnaissance and aerial observation, suppressed or destroyed many British gun positions. Without artillery support, the British infantry would be left vulnerable to the coming assault. And finally, at 9:40 a.m., 5 hours after the bombardment began, German guns shifted their fire to the British frontline trenches. For precisely 30 minutes, a storm of steel and gas crashed down on the forward positions. And then, at 9:40 a.m., the guns lifted, and out of the fog came the Stormtroopers. The German infantry advance was unlike anything the British had seen before. The Stormtroopers did not advance in neat waves, easily targeted by machine guns. They moved in small groups, using the fog as cover, infiltrating through gaps in the British line, bypassing strongpoints, moving with shocking speed toward objectives miles behind the front. British defenders, stunned by the bombardment, emerging from dugouts to find their communication lines cut and their officers killed or missing, suddenly saw Germans emerging from the fog all around them. Some positions fought desperately, holding out for hours. Others, surrounded and cut off, surrendered quickly. Many British soldiers simply did not know what was happening. The fog and the chaos of the bombardment had created complete confusion. And it was not just the front line that was being hit. German stormtroopers, pushing deep through the British positions, were appearing miles to the rear, capturing artillery batteries whose crews had not even realized the front line had broken, overrunning headquarters and supply dumps, spreading panic and confusion throughout the entire British defensive system. The British Fifth Army, holding the southern sector of the attack, bore the brunt of the German assault. General Gough's army had been extended over a wider front than it could properly defend, with insufficient troops and incomplete defensive positions. Now it faced the full weight of the German offensive, 43 German divisions attacking just 14 British divisions. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The Germans outnumbered the British by more than 3-1 at the point of attack. And with their stormtrooper tactics allowing them to exploit every weakness, every gap, the British defensive system began to come apart. By the end of March 21st, German forces had advanced up to 5 miles in some sectors, the deepest penetration on the Western Front since the fluid battles of 1914. British casualties for the day exceeded 38,000, including 21,000 taken prisoner, entire battalions that had been surrounded and forced to surrender. Over 500 artillery pieces had been captured or destroyed. But this was only the beginning. Over the following days, the German advance continued. March 22nd saw another advance of several miles. March 23rd saw the Germans crossing the old Somme battlefield, that desolate wasteland where British and German armies had fought through the second half of 1916. The battlefields of 1916 and 1917, Pozières, Thiepval, Delville Wood, all the places where so many had died for a few hundred yards of ground, now fell to the Germans in a matter of hours. The British Fifth Army was in full retreat, falling back 10, 15, 20 miles from its original positions. Units became separated from their commands. Entire divisions lost cohesion. The retreat, while not quite a rout, was dangerously close to becoming one. And critically, the Fifth Army was losing contact with the French forces to the south. The junction between the two armies, the weak point Ludendorff had targeted, was opening up. By March 24th, German forces were within 10 miles of the vital rail junction at Amiens. If Amiens fell, the British and French armies would be effectively separated. The British would be forced to retreat toward the Channel ports. The French would retreat toward Paris. And Germany would have achieved the breakthrough that had eluded them for 3.5 years. At Allied headquarters, there was something close to panic. The British commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, was contemplating a retreat toward the Channel ports, exactly what Ludendorff wanted. The French commander, Philippe Pétain, was preparing to protect Paris, which meant pulling French forces southward, widening the gap. The fundamental problem was that the British and French armies operated under separate commands. There was no unified command structure, no single authority that could coordinate the Allied response. Each national army was fighting its own battle, making decisions based on its own priorities, and in doing so, playing directly into German hands. On March 26, with the crisis deepening by the hour, Allied political and military leaders met in the small town of Doullens, near Amiens. The meeting was tense, sometimes acrimonious. But from it emerged a decision that would prove crucial. General Ferdinand Foch, the French commander who had fought at the Marne, Verdun, and countless other battles, was appointed to coordinate all Allied armies on the Western Front. Foch did not have absolute authority. He could not simply issue orders to British or French commanders. But he could coordinate strategy, allocate reserves, and most importantly, he could prevent the British and French from falling back in different directions. His first order was simple and direct: hold Amiens at all costs. The British would not retreat toward the Channel. The French would not retreat toward Paris. The line would hold, even if it meant sacrificing ground elsewhere. But would the line hold? By late March, German forces were still advancing. The momentum of the offensive, while slowing, had not yet stopped. Fresh German divisions continued to arrive at the front, throwing themselves into the attack. The prize, Amiens, the separation of the Allied armies, perhaps even decisive victory, seemed tantalizingly close. On the British side, reserves were being rushed forward, divisions pulled from quiet sectors, colonial troops, newly arrived units. The French were sending reinforcements north to support the British, honoring Foch's directive even though it meant leaving other sectors undermanned. And then, gradually at first but with increasing clarity, it became apparent that the German advance was losing momentum. The attacks on March 27th gained less ground than those on March 26th. The attacks on March 28th gained even less. By March 30th, some German attacks were being repulsed entirely, making no gains at all. The reasons were complex, but they boiled down to two fundamental problems. First, the Germans were outrunning their supply lines. Second, the British and French were bringing up reinforcements faster than the Germans could push forward. The balance of forces, which had favored Germany so decisively on March 21st, was shifting back toward equilibrium. On April 4th, German forces made one final push toward Amiens, attacking the village of Villers-Bretonneux, which stood as the last significant obstacle before the rail junction. Australian divisions, rushed to this critical sector, counterattacked fiercely. The battle swayed back and forth through the day and into the night, but by morning, the village remained in Allied hands. It was the high water mark of Operation Michael. German forces would advance no further. On April 5, 1918, Ludendorff officially called off the offensive. Operation Michael was over. In 2 weeks of fighting, German forces had achieved the deepest penetration on the Western Front since 1914, advancing up to 40 miles in some sectors, capturing over 90,000 prisoners and 1,300 guns, inflicting approximately 240,000 Allied casualties. It was an extraordinary tactical success, perhaps the most successful offensive operation on the Western Front during the entire war. And yet, Ludendorff had not achieved his strategic objectives. The British and French armies had not been separated. Amiens had not fallen. The Channel ports remained in Allied hands. The breakthrough had not led to decisive victory. And now, the question was, at what cost? To understand why Operation Michael failed to achieve decisive victory despite its spectacular initial success, one must look beyond the battles themselves to the mundane but crucial reality of logistics, the unglamorous business of moving supplies, ammunition, and food from rear areas to the fighting front. And in this unglamorous but vital area, the German offensive was failing catastrophically. The problem was inherent in the nature of the offensive. The infiltration tactics that had worked so brilliantly in the breakthrough phase created enormous difficulties in the exploitation phase. The Stormtrooper units had advanced 40 miles in 2 weeks, an astonishing pace by Western Front standards. But in doing so, they had moved far faster than their supply train could follow. The German logistics system was built around railroads. Supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements could be moved rapidly and in huge quantities by rail, but only to the extent that the railroad network existed and functioned. And the railroad network, in the territory the Germans had just overrun, had been systematically destroyed by the retreating British. Moreover, the ground the Germans were advancing across was not normal terrain. It was the Somme battlefield, the devastated, crater-pocked wasteland where British and German armies had fought through 1916 and 1917. The roads had been destroyed. The villages had been leveled. The bridges had been blown. The entire landscape was a maze of shell craters, trenches, and barbed wire. Moving supplies across this terrain was nightmarishly difficult. Horse-drawn wagons could barely navigate the mud and craters. Motor trucks, still a relatively new technology, broke down constantly. Artillery pieces became bogged down and had to be abandoned. The German advance was creating a supply line that stretched further every day while simultaneously becoming less capable of actually supplying the forward troops. The result was that German soldiers at the front were running short of everything. Ammunition supplies dwindled, artillery batteries rationed shells, firing only at the most critical targets. Food became scarce, soldiers on half rations, sometimes going days without hot meals. Water was in short supply, units were reduced to drinking from shell craters, risking dysentery and other diseases. Medical supplies ran out, the wounded could not be properly treated, and evacuation to rear hospitals became increasingly difficult. And exhaustion set in. The Stormtroopers who had spearheaded the advance had been fighting continuously for 2 weeks. They had marched dozens of miles, attacked enemy positions, fought through multiple defensive lines, and pushed forward day after day with minimal rest. Even elite troops have limits, and those limits were being reached. But there was another factor that contributed to the loss of momentum, one that revealed the desperate state of German society after 3.5 years of war and the effects of the Allied naval blockade. As German soldiers advanced across the old Somme battlefield and into territory that had been behind British lines, they encountered something many had not seen in years: abundance. British supply dumps, hastily abandoned during the retreat, contained food in quantities that seemed unimaginable to German soldiers who had been on reduced rations for months or years. The blockade of Germany had been devastatingly effective. The British Royal Navy had cut off Germany's overseas trade, preventing the import of food, raw materials, and other necessities. By 1918, Germans at home were suffering from severe food shortages. The infamous turnip winter of 1916 to 1917 had seen widespread malnutrition and starvation. Soldiers, who received somewhat better rations than civilians, were still chronically hungry. And now, these hungry soldiers found themselves in British supply dumps filled with white bread, canned meat, chocolate, tea, sugar, luxuries they had not tasted in years. Units that should have been pushing forward stopped to eat. Soldiers loaded themselves down with food, slowing their advance. Discipline broke down as men, half-starved, gorged themselves on captured supplies. German officers tried to maintain discipline, to keep their men moving forward, but it was difficult. How do you order starving men to ignore food and continue fighting? Some units lost hours, even days, as they consumed captured supplies. The offensive's momentum, which depended on speed and continuous pressure, was being dissipated by the very abundance the soldiers encountered in Allied rear areas. It was a bitter irony. The German offensive was failing in part because German society had been so weakened by the blockade that its soldiers could not resist the temptation to stop and eat when they encountered adequate food supplies. While German momentum was faltering, the Allied response was strengthening. Fresh divisions continued to arrive, British units from other sectors, French reinforcements, and critically, newly arrived divisions from the British Empire. Canadian and Australian troops, recognized as among the finest assault troops in the Allied armies, were rushed to critical sectors. The defense of Villers-Bretonneux on April 4th epitomized the new Allied determination. Australian divisions, attacking at dawn, retook ground that had been lost the previous day. The battle was fierce, with hand-to-hand combat in the ruins of the village, but the Australians held. And in holding Villers-Bretonneux, they held the gateway to Amiens. But the most terrible aspect of Operation Michael's failure was the casualty list. German losses in the offensive were staggering. Estimates vary, but approximately 240,000 German casualties in the 3 weeks of Operation Michael alone. And critically, a disproportionate number of these casualties were among the Stormtrooper units, the elite assault troops who had led the advance. These were Germany's best soldiers, young, fit, highly trained, experienced, and motivated. They were irreplaceable. Germany no longer had the resources to train new Stormtrooper units. The losses among these elite formations effectively gutted the German army of its offensive capability. Moreover, while the Germans had suffered 240,000 casualties, the British and French had suffered approximately 255,000, a similar number. But there was a crucial difference. The Allies could replace their losses. American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 250,000 per month by April 1918. The British and French could draw on their remaining reserves. Germany, by contrast, had committed everything to this offensive. There were no more reserves. No more elite divisions to throw into battle. The offensive had consumed Germany's last strength. Ludendorff recognized that Operation Michael had failed to achieve decisive results, but he believed he could not simply stop. To halt the offensive entirely would be to admit failure, to give the Allies time to rebuild their defenses and bring up more American reinforcements. So he ordered new offensives, Operation Georgette in Flanders in April, Operation Blücherjoch on the Aisne in May, and finally Operation Mannschutzreims in July. Each offensive followed the same pattern: initial success, rapid advance, captured territory, heavy casualties, and then the advance would stall as supplies ran out and Allied resistance stiffened. Each offensive was smaller than the last, achieving less, costing more. Germany was not winning the war. It was bleeding itself to death in a series of offensives that gained nothing of strategic value. By July 1918, the German Spring Offensive, all 5 separate operations combined, had cost Germany approximately 680,000 casualties. The German army had advanced dozens of miles in some sectors, creating large salients that bulged into Allied territory. But these salients were difficult to defend, and they had captured no decisive objectives. The Channel ports remained in Allied hands. Paris was still secure. The British and French armies had not been separated. And now, with Germany exhausted, with its best troops dead or wounded, with its supplies depleted and its strategic reserve non-existent, the Allies prepared to counterattack. In the late summer of 1918, the tide of the First World War turned decisively and irrevocably. The German Spring Offensive, which had begun in March with such high hopes and such dramatic success, had spent itself. Germany had thrown everything into one final gamble and had come up short. Now it was the Allies' turn. And the Allies, unified under Focker's coordination, supplied by American industry, and reinforced by hundreds of thousands of fresh American troops, would not squander their opportunity. The strategic results of Operation Michael and the broader Spring Offensive were paradoxical. By the measures of territorial gain and enemy casualties, the offensives had been successful. Germany had recaptured more ground in 3 months than the Allies had taken in 3 years of offensive operations. German forces had advanced 40 miles at the deepest point of penetration. They had inflicted over 400,000 Allied casualties across all the spring operations. But territory without strategic value is meaningless. And the territory Germany had captured was exactly that, meaningless. The Germans now held large salients that projected deep into Allied territory, but these salients were difficult to defend and supply. They had captured ruined villages and devastated battlefields, but not vital rail junctions, not channel ports, not strategic objectives that would force the Allies to negotiate. Most critically, Amiens had not fallen. The vital rail junction that connected the British and French armies, that allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies, remained in Allied hands. As long as Amiens held, the Allies could concentrate forces where they needed them, could respond to German threats, could maintain the unified front that Foch had fought so hard to preserve. And the channel ports, Calais, Boulogne, Dunkirk, through which the British Expeditionary Force received all its supplies, all its reinforcements, all its connection to Britain, these too remained secure. The German advance had never come close to threatening them. The British Army would not be cut off from its supply base. It would not be forced to evacuate, as Ludendorff had hoped. But beyond the strategic failure, there was the human cost. Germany had lost 680,000 men in the spring offensive, killed, wounded, captured. These were losses Germany could not afford and could not replace. The Stormtrooper units that had spearheaded the attacks had been decimated. The junior officers and NCOs who had provided leadership and expertise were dead or wounded. The army that emerged from the spring offensive was a shadow of what it had been in March. And the home front was collapsing. The blockade continued to strangle Germany's economy. Food riots broke out in German cities. Strikes disrupted war production. Morale, which had risen briefly with the initial successes of the spring offensive, plummeted as it became clear that the offensives had achieved nothing decisive. People began to ask, if Germany could not win even when it had numerical superiority, how could it possibly win now that American troops were arriving in overwhelming numbers? On August 8, 1918, a day Ludendorff would later call the Black Day of the German Army, the Allies launched their counteroffensive at Amiens. British, Australian, Canadian, and French forces, supported by hundreds of tanks and overwhelming artillery, smashed through German positions and advanced 8 miles in a single day. German units, exhausted and demoralized, surrendered en masse or simply retreated without fighting. It was the beginning of what would be called the 100 Days Offensive, the final Allied campaign that would break the German army and end the war. Through August, September, and October, Allied forces attacked relentlessly, driving the Germans back from all the territory they had captured in the spring offensive and more. The German army, unable to replace its losses, unable to restore its shattered divisions, fell back day by day, week by week. Operation Michael stands in history as one of the great what ifs of the First World War. What if the Germans had broken through at Amiens? What if they had separated the British and French armies? What if they had forced the British to evacuate? Could Germany have won the war, or at least forced a negotiated peace favorable to German interests? The answer, almost certainly, is no. Even if Operation Michael had achieved all its tactical objectives, even if Amiens had fallen and the British had been forced to retreat toward the Channel, Germany lacked the strategic depth to exploit such success. The American reinforcements were already arriving. The Allied material superiority was already overwhelming. Germany's economy and society were already collapsing under the strain of the blockade. What Operation Michael actually achieved was to hasten Germany's defeat. By committing its last reserves, by sacrificing its best troops, by exhausting its remaining offensive capability in a series of operations that gained nothing of strategic value, Germany ensured that when the Allied counteroffensive came, there would be nothing left to stop it. The German Spring Offensive was not Germany's last chance to win the war. By 1918, Germany had no chance to win the war. The Spring Offensive was Germany's last chance to avoid catastrophic defeat, to secure a negotiated peace, to end the war while Germany still had an army in the field, while its territory was still largely unoccupied. And that chance, like so many others in the Great War, was lost in the mud and blood of the Western Front. Operation Michael. March 21st through April 5, 1918. Germany's final gamble. A tactical triumph that achieved nothing strategic. An offensive that advanced 40 miles but captured no decisive objectives. A battle that cost 680,000 German casualties and exhausted Germany's last offensive strength, setting the stage for the final Allied victory just 7 months later. The last throw of the dice. And the dice came up short. Operation Michael gained more ground than any action on the Western Front since 1914, pushing the Allies back to the brink. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The cost was too high. The elite stormtroopers were decimated, the gains were unsustainable, and critically, the offensive failed to capture the vital rail hubs or split the British and French armies. In saving their position, the Allies had been forced into unified command under General Foch. And as the exhausted German troops dug in, the fresh power of the American Expeditionary Force was ready to join the fight. The spring offensive did not win the war. It merely ensured Germany could not lose it quickly enough. If you want to understand how a last desperate gamble can seal a nation's fate, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and join the discussion below. We want to know, given the strategic necessity, was Ludendorff right to risk everything on the spring offensive, or was it doomed from the start? Thanks for watching.